The year is 586 BCE. Jerusalem has fallen. As smoke rises from the holy city's charred remains, citizens of the wealthy port of Tyre are celebrating. Their rival's demise means profit and prosperity for their island stronghold, while the people of Judah weep in exile. Tyrian merchants raise glasses of wine, toasting their good fortune. But 500 miles away, in the dust and heat of Babylon, a prophet named Ezekiel stands rigid in the grip of divine fury. His eyes blaze with righteous anger as words of judgment pour from his lips. Words that continue to cause debates 2,600 years later. Thus says the Lord God, "Behold, I am against you, O Tyre. I will bring against you many nations. They will destroy your walls and break down your towers. I will scrape her soil from her and make her a bare rock." Ezekiel's voice rises. "You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken." And yet, Tyre still stands today in 2026. This thriving Lebanese city has been continuously inhabited for nearly 5,000 years. So how did this biblical city escape its prophesied doom? Why does the Bible itself seem to acknowledge this prophetic failure? And what does this remarkable case study reveal about the nature of prophecy itself? In case you're new here, I'm Derek Lambert, and this is MythVision, where we examine biblical history through a critical lens. Today, we will be exploring one of the most fascinating cases of unfulfilled prophecy in the Bible, Ezekiel's oracle against Tyre, the city that defied divine destruction. If you're looking for further information from an academic themselves, Dr. Joshua Bowen and I have talked about this in interviews in the past on the channel. So please consider subscribing, joining what we're doing here, especially if you find this historical analysis valuable. Hit the like button, the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming episodes on biblical prophecies and their historical context, because that's what we do here. The story begins in the Babylonian exile. The year is 586 BCE, and Jerusalem has just fallen to the armies, plural, of King Nebuchadnezzar II. The sacred temple lies in ruins. The royal palace is ashes, and thousands of Judean survivors have been force-marched to Babylon as captives. Among these exiles is Ezekiel, a prophet and former priest, already known for his bizarre symbolic acts and apocalyptic visions. Ezekiel now becomes a voice of divine vengeance against his people's enemies, and no enemy has earned more scorn than Tyre. But you might be wondering, why so much hatred for Tyre? The answer is quite simple. According to Ezekiel 26 verse 2, Tyre had gloated over Jerusalem's destruction. Aha! The gate to the nations is broken, and its doors have swung open to me. Now that she lies in ruins, I will prosper. Interesting how the author of Ezekiel seems to know what Tyre's thinking in this situation. This merciless celebration of Judah's suffering triggers one of the most vicious prophecies in Hebrew Bible. In vivid, unflinching language, Ezekiel claims God will unleash Nebuchadnezzar against Tyre as an instrument of divine punishment. But to understand the prophecy's significance, we will need to understand Tyre itself. Tyre was no ordinary city. It was a wealthy, maritime superpower of the ancient world. Think of it like the Manhattan of the Mediterranean. The main city sat on a heavily fortified island about half a mile offshore, connected to its mainland suburb by a causeway. These natural defenses made Tyre virtually impregnable. For centuries, the greatest powers of the Near East had tried and failed to conquer it. Yet, Ezekiel insists this mighty fortress will be utterly destroyed. Let's examine the details of this prophecy in Ezekiel chapter 26. Verses 3 through 6, many nations will come up against you like the sea casting up its waves. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and pull down her towers. I will scrape away her rubble and make her a bare rock. She will become plunder for the nations. Verses 7 through 11, for this is what the sovereign Lord says. From the north I am going to bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a great army. He will ravage your settlements on the mainland with the sword. His horses will be so many that they will cover you with dust. Your strong pillars will fall to the ground. Verses 12 through 14, they will plunder your wealth and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and demolish your fine houses and throw your stones, timber, and rubble into the sea. I will make you a bare rock, and you will become a place to spread fish nets. You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken. Literally, the audacity of this prophecy cannot be overstated. Ezekiel is declaring that the most secure city in the region, a city that had successfully resisted the Assyrian Empire for 5 years and had never been conquered, would be utterly obliterated by Babylon. Not just defeated, but erased. Not just damaged, but scraped to bare rock and cast into the sea. And not just temporarily occupied, but never rebuilt. For Ezekiel's audience of displaced Judeans, this would have been a powerful message of hope. The enemy who mocked their suffering would soon suffer even worse. And so the stage was set. Nebuchadnezzar would march against Tyre. God's word would be fulfilled. Justice would be served, or so Ezekiel believed. You see, Nebuchadnezzar did indeed historically come against Tyre. The Babylonian armies arrived in 586 BCE, fresh from their triumph at Jerusalem, and just as Ezekiel foretold, they besieged the proud Phoenician city. But this is where prophecy and history begin to diverge. The siege of Tyre became one of the longest in ancient history. For 13 years, from 586 to 573 BCE, the Babylonian forces pressed their attack. They easily conquered the mainland, settlements, destroying buildings, and slaughtering resistors, just as Ezekiel had described. But the island city, Tyre proper, proved a different matter. Protected by massive walls and surrounded by water, it could be supplied by sea even while besieged by land. The Phoenicians were literally master sailors. The Babylonians were not. Without a heavy navy to enforce a total blockade, Nebuchadnezzar could only stare across the water at his elusive prey and never really get them. As the years dragged on and on, the toll on Babylon's army grew severe. Ezekiel himself would later describe how the soldiers' heads were rubbed bare and their shoulders were raw from the endless labor of the siege. So what happened next? Did the mighty walls of Tyre finally crumble before Babylonian battering rams? Did Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers pour into the city, putting its inhabitants to the sword and tearing down its fine houses? No, they did not. The historical record tells a very different story from Ezekiel's prophecy. After 13 years of stalemate, the siege ended inconclusively. According to the Phoenician records cited by the historian Josephus, Tyre's king Ithobal, or Ithobaal, ruled throughout the siege and was succeeded by his son. There was no massacre, no destruction of the island city, No debris thrown into the sea. Modern Phoenician scholarship makes clear that Nebuchadnezzar's long campaign against Tyre did not end in the city's destruction. As the Phoenician historian, and I might butcher this, Joseti Ilai explains, how did the siege of Tyre end? In failure for Nebuchadnezzar II, as the island town was probably not taken. She notes that the Babylonian siege dragged on for years without delivering the decisive outcome anticipated in prophetic rhetoric, a reality already acknowledged in the Hebrew Bible itself, Ezekiel 29:18. Eli further argues that rather than a catastrophic conquest, the conflict likely concluded with a political accommodation. Even if the island of Tyre was not captured, a treaty was probably concluded. Tyrian kingship was preserved. In other words, Tyre was neither destroyed nor depopulated, but remained a functioning city-state with its own ruler, albeit under Babylonian pressure. This historical reconstruction sharply undercuts literal readings of Ezekiel's earlier oracles, predicting Tyre's total annihilation, and confirms that later biblical texts quietly recalibrate those expectations in light of historical reality. Shoot, even the biblical evidence contradicts Ezekiel's forecast. The later prophet Zechariah, writing decades after Nebuchadnezzar's campaign, describes Tyre as still wealthy and fortified, awaiting future judgment. This only makes sense if Tyre had survived the Babylonian attack, largely intact. It reminds me of kicking the can down the road. When prophecy fails, some people still wait for it, even though some timestamps are in the earlier material, suggesting they thought it was supposed to happen back here. But God can't fail, so let's keep kicking the damn can down the road into the future. But what about the archaeological record? It shows no layer of destruction from the early 6th century BCE that would correspond to a violent conquest by Babylonian forces. And here's the inescapable conclusion. Nebuchadnezzar failed to conquer Tyre. The island city weathered the storm. Rather than being flattened and emptied of life as Ezekiel foresaw or prophesied, Tyre negotiated some form of settlement with Babylon, perhaps paying tribute while maintaining autonomy. And far from being reduced to a bare rock where fishermen spread their nets, Tyre continued as a thriving commercial hub for centuries to come. It would pass under Persian rule, then Greek, then Roman, but it was never uninhabited for any significant period. And most importantly, Tyre continues to exist today as a Lebanese city with over 100,000 people, a living contradiction of the prophecy that would never be rebuilt. Ironically, fishermen do spread their nets on the rocks by Tyre shore today, but alongside those rocks stand massive hotels, homes, and the ruins of Roman buildings. This is hardly the picture of uninhabited desolation that Ezekiel envisioned. To be blunt, Ezekiel's prophecy, where he's speaking on behalf of God, as if God's speaking against the city of Tyre, at least regarding Nebuchadnezzar's role, had failed. So if you see Ezekiel as God speaking, then God failed. It wouldn't shock me with other passages suggesting that chariots defeated Yahweh. But now we come to one of the most extraordinary parts of this story. The Bible itself appears to acknowledge the prophecy's failure, and that is usually very rare. You see, 16 years after his original oracle against Tyre, Ezekiel receives another message from God, one that essentially revises the previous prophecy. And this remarkable passage appears in Ezekiel 29:17-20. And it's dated to roughly 571 BCE, after the marathon siege of Tyre had ended without the promised outcome. In the 27th year, in the first month, on the first day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, drove his army in a hard campaign against Tyre. Every head was rubbed bare, and every shoulder made raw. Yet he and his army got no reward from Tyre for the campaign he led against it. Seriously, let that sink in. Ezekiel himself openly states that Nebuchadnezzar got no reward from Tyre. The siege that was supposed to end with Tyre's complete destruction instead left Babylon with nothing to show for 13 years of effort. But rather than simply admitting error, Ezekiel offers a divine course correction. Go figure. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am going to give Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will carry off its wealth. He will loot and plunder the land as pay for his army. I have given him Egypt as a reward for his efforts because he and his army did it for me, declares the sovereign Lord. This passage is astonishing in its implications. Egypt is presented as a consolation prize, a divine make-up gift to Nebuchadnezzar for his services rendered against Tyre. It's as if God is saying, you didn't get your payment from Tyre as promised by me, so I'll give you Egypt instead. God is a promise breaker here. Critical scholars like Robert P. Carroll see this as obvious, clear evidence of awareness of a prediction lacking fulfillment. The oracle about Egypt appears to be a retrospective theological explanation for why things didn't go as originally prophesied, what scholars call Vaticanum ex eventu, or prophecy after the fact. I think what makes this passage even more shocking is its candor. Ezekiel chapter 29 doesn't try to spin Tyre's survival as a partial fulfillment, or quietly just drop the subject. It bluntly states Nebuchadnezzar got nothing from Tyre. This admission is then coupled with a theological rationalization. God will give him Egypt instead. Yet even this replacement prophecy about Egypt introduces its own set of problems. Ezekiel predicts that Nebuchadnezzar will ravage Egypt, leave its cities desolate for 40 years, and scatter its population among the nations. Did this catastrophic scenario actually happen? Nope, it did not. At least not in any literal, historically documented way. While Babylon did campaign in Egypt after the Tyre siege, historical records show no such comprehensive devastation. Egypt remained intact as a civilization and never experienced a 40-year period of desolation. So if Ezekiel 29 was intended to patch up one failed prediction, it arguably introduced another unfulfilled prophecy in the process. And from a critical standpoint, what we're seeing is an example of prophetic revisionism. When reality didn't match the original prophecy, a new divine revelation conveniently appeared to preserve theological integrity while acknowledging historical reality. The apparent failure of Ezekiel's Tyre prophecy has not gone unnoticed through history. For those who believe biblical prophecies must come true with literal accuracy, Ezekiel 26 presents a challenging puzzle. Over the centuries, various apologetic explanations have been offered to reconcile prophecy with history. Let's examine three common defensive strategies. First, the many nations defense. Some apologists emphasize that Ezekiel 26:3 mentions many nations coming against Tyre. They argue that while Nebuchadnezzar started the job, other nations finished it later. They point to Alexander the Great, who in around 332 BCE, over 250 years after Ezekiel's prophecy, conquered Tyre after building a causeway to the island using debris from the main city. This action does echo Ezekiel's imagery of casting Tyre's debris into the sea. Therefore, apologists claim the prophecy was fulfilled, just in stages. Nebuchadnezzar began the process, and Alexander completed it. The problem? Ezekiel specifically names Nebuchadnezzar as the agent of Tyre's destruction, describing in detail what he would do to the city. The passage doesn't read like a prediction spanning centuries. Furthermore, Ezekiel's later consolation prize oracle suggests he expected Tyre's fate to be decided in the Babylonian era, not left hanging for future Greek armies. Not to mention its utter destruction, never to be rebuilt, according to Ezekiel. Second, the pronoun parsing defense. A more technical argument involves the pronouns in Ezekiel 26. Some apologists note that the prophecy uses he, Nebuchadnezzar, in some verses, and they, unspecified nations, in others. They suggest a deliberate shift signals that Nebuchadnezzar would accomplish some actions while other nations would complete the rest. While grammatically clever, this interpretation feels contrived. The natural reading is that they refers to Nebuchadnezzar's forces carrying out his commands, not to future attackers centuries later. This kind of hair-splitting arises only when trying to preserve the prophecy's validity at all costs. And to be very frank, that's what Christian apologists and other apologists do daily, and they don't realize it. And third, the eventually destroyed defense. Some apologists claim the prophecy was fulfilled because Tyre was eventually destroyed and never regained its former glory. They point to Alexander's devastating conquest or to later destructions like the Mamluk razing in 1291 of the Common Era as fulfilling "you will never be rebuilt." Ladies and gentlemen, this stretches credulity. If one extends any prophecy across enough centuries, some event might vaguely fit, but that's not how prophecy is presented in Ezekiel. And crucially, Tyre was rebuilt after each destruction. By Roman times, it was flourishing again. Modern Tyre is a substantial city, hardly the picture of permanent desolation Ezekiel described. Frankly, critical scholars find these harmonizations unconvincing. In fact, they are rather contrived attempts to force-fit history into prophecy. The simplest explanation is the one Ezekiel 29 itself implies. Ezekiel expected Nebuchadnezzar to destroy Tyre. Nebuchadnezzar failed. Later, this failure was acknowledged by shifting focus to Egypt. One of the most fascinating aspects of this case is how the Bible's editors handled this problematic prophecy. The book of Ezekiel was compiled after the events in question, yet it preserves both the original Tyre oracle, chapter 26, and the subsequent adjustment oracle, chapter 29, side by side. I mean, why didn't the compilers remove or alter the obviously unfulfilled prophecy to save Ezekiel from embarrassment? I mean, it really is striking that the compilers of the biblical book allowed the earlier and later passages about Tyre to stand side by side. They could have left out or altered the older prophecy. The fact that they didn't suggests they had little or maybe no issue with the tension between the two prophecies. So this could be seen as evidence of editorial honesty, preserving the prophetic tradition, warts and all. It's almost as if the editor said, like, yes, Ezekiel said Tyre would be destroyed, and it wasn't, and here's how he later addressed it. But alternatively, keeping both prophecies might serve a theological purpose by showing God reassigning punishment to Egypt. The text asserts that divine justice still operates, just in a redirected form. The underlying message that God opposes proud nations remains intact even if the specific mechanism changes. Rather than undermine prophetic authority, the compilers may have felt that the moral lesson remained valid. Tyre's arrogance and rejoicing over Jerusalem's fall was still offensive to God, even if the punishment took a different form than initially predicted. From a more skeptical viewpoint, this is theological rationalization after the fact. Critics like Robert Carroll see it as evidence of how prophetic tradition copes with failure. Rather than omit the failure, it is reframed. Tyre's destruction is postponed or handed to others, while the prophet's overall message of judgment continues in a modified form. I deep dive into cognitive dissonance if I were you. It would help people understand what happens when prophecy fails. Whatever your perspective, Ezekiel and Tyre provide a remarkable case study in prophetic non-fulfillment documented within the biblical text itself. Rare case. The editors did not try to harmonize the two passages. They let the tension stand, suggesting ancient compilers weren't as concerned with literal prophetic accuracy as some modern interpreters. As our journey ends, let's return to present-day Tyre, a city that has survived countless sieges, earthquakes, and conquest across nearly 5 millennia of continuous habitation. Standing on its sun-drenched shore, where fishermen indeed spread their nets on the rocks, we can see the layers of history: Phoenician foundations, Roman columns, Byzantine mosaics, Crusader walls, and modern Lebanese homes. This living, breathing city stands as a silent witness to the complex reality of biblical prophecy. Ezekiel's unfulfilled oracle against Tyre raises some interesting questions about the nature of prophecy itself. Was it meant to be taken as literal prediction or as theological expression? Does a prophecy's value lie in its factual accuracy or in the moral principle it conveys? For critical scholars, the Tyre episode really shows how prophecy in the Hebrew Bible was not always about predicting exact future events, like a news report in advance. Rather, it was often expressed like in theological convictions that might be reapplied if circumstances changed. It literally gave hope to their current hopelessness or sufferings. For believers, Tyre's story can be seen as a humbling reminder that not every prophetic utterance in the Bible came true to the letter, yet these texts were preserved for their larger lessons. If one approaches Ezekiel as a product of his time, it's perhaps not surprising that he, like other prophets, sometimes misjudged the timing or mechanism of divine plans. And what of Tyre itself? There's a certain irony that after all the dramatic curses and imagery of desolation, the city literally endures. If Ezekiel could see modern Tyre with people living their lives amid ancient ruins and new buildings, what would he think? Perhaps he would maintain that eventually Tyre met its fate, or that the true Tyre, its imperial pride, was indeed broken by subsequent empires, even if stones and mortar remained. Or perhaps he would recognize that his ultimate concern was not the physical city at all, but the principle that no nation can permanently escape accountability for its actions. In the end, Tyre's continued existence stands as a powerful reminder of the gap between prophetic certainty and historical complexity. A prophecy that declared, "You will never be rebuilt," confronts a city that has rebuilt itself countless times. And the tension between these realities invites us to be more nuanced and have better understanding of biblical prophecy. One that acknowledges its limitations while appreciating its enduring moral insights. This is MythVision. I'm Derek Lambert. If you've enjoyed this exploration of biblical prophecy and history, please subscribe to our channel and join us next time as we continue to examine the fascinating intersections of ancient texts and historical reality. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, even failed prophecies can tell us profound truths about the human search for meaning in an unpredictable world. I also want to take the time to give a special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters who make these investigations, these videos, the time that goes into the research, and everything that we do possible. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you. And never forget, we are MythVision.